The Empire Strikes Back opens without warmth or invitation. It does not greet the audience as an adventure returning home. It emerges like a cold room entered without warning, already hostile and already occupied by something unseen. The tone is not excitement but tension, the sense that something is wrong before anything visibly happens, which is the first language of horror, rather than mythic heroism. From the earliest frames, the film establishes that the monster is not introduced through action, but through atmosphere. Darth Vader does not sprint or roar, he materializes, framed by scale and absence. His entrances are delayed just long enough to allow dread to form, which mirrors slasher logic, where the threat is defined by inevitability rather than speed or surprise. Vader is photographed less like a rival and more like a force, emerging from smoke or shadow, occupying the center of the frame as if the environment itself has yielded to him. The camera rarely challenges his presence, it submits, reinforcing that resistance is symbolic at best and futile at worst. Like the great horror icons, Vader does not need pursuit scenes to feel dominant. He does not chase. The narrative moves toward him regardless of intention, which reframes the entire film as an extended approach toward confrontation that cannot be avoided, only delayed. This is why his silence carries more weight than dialogue. The absence of chatter allows space for projection, for fear to grow unchecked, much like the Terminator or other unstoppable figures whose threat lies in consistency rather than emotion. The Empire itself mirrors this philosophy. It does not react to the heroes, it advances as if following a predetermined path. Hoth is not a battle but an evacuation. The outcome is known before the first blaster fires, and the tension comes from how much can be saved before collapse, rather than whether collapse will happen. Every Imperial victory is framed as clean and efficient. There is no chaos in their movement, only pressure, which aligns them with horror antagonists who operate according to rules the protagonists do not yet understand. The pursuit of the Falcon is not staged as a clever cat-and-mouse game. It is a narrowing corridor. Each hyperspace failure feels less like bad luck and more like fate correcting itself, reminding the heroes that escape is temporary and conditional. Cloud City continues this pattern by removing the illusion of sanctuary entirely. The heroes arrive already too late. The betrayal is not a twist but a confirmation. Safety was never real. It was only borrowed time. Horror thrives on environments that promise relief and then revoke it, and Bespin embodies this with surgical precision. Its sterile halls and polished surfaces feel less alive than the frozen wasteland of Hoth, emphasizing that comfort without trust is another form of trap. Dagobah offers no refuge either. Despite its role as a place of learning, it is decaying, wet, and disorienting, a landscape that resists clarity, forcing Luke inward rather than upward. Training here is not empowering. It is destabilizing. Luke does not seek wisdom out of curiosity or ambition. He is driven by fear and urgency, lured by visions that function like horror premonitions, fragmentary and invasive, pulling him toward confrontation before he is ready. This inversion is crucial. The hero does not grow through preparation, but fractures through haste, a hallmark of horror where characters act under pressure rather than strategy, and consequences arrive immediately. Han and Leia follow a similar trajectory. Their story is defined by locked doors and shrinking options. They do not initiate plans, they respond to threats, constantly repositioning within spaces that refuse to stay neutral. The Falcon becomes less a symbol of freedom and more a claustrophobic vessel. Its broken systems and dim corridors echo the trapped settings of survival horror, where movement exists but progress does not. Even the film pacing supports this reading. Scenes rarely end with resolution. They cut away at moments of instability, denying emotional release and reinforcing the sense that danger persists off-screen. Music and sound design further underline the horror structure. Silence is used as weaponry, while familiar themes are fragmented or withheld, denying the audience the reassurance of musical triumph. Hope appears only to be undermined. Training injures rather than heals. Alliances fail under pressure, and victories reveal themselves as delays, not solutions, reinforcing that survival is provisional. This approach reframes the idea of heroism entirely. Endurance replaces bravery, persistence replaces courage, and the emotional cost becomes the metric of success rather than territorial gain. The film teaches the audience to expect loss, not because it seeks nihilism, but because horror functions by normalizing damage, making pain part of the landscape rather than an aberration. By the time Vader fully engages Luke, the confrontation feels less like a duel and more like a reckoning that has been approaching since the opening crawl. The monster has arrived exactly when expected. The visual language of the duel reinforces this inevitability. Vast negative space surrounds the characters. Machinery looms without purpose, and the environment feels indifferent to outcome. A classic horror staging, where the setting does not care who survives. Vader toys with Luke not out of cruelty, but certainty, the confidence of a predator who knows the maze. Every retreat leads deeper inside. Every strike narrows the path forward. Luke fighting back does not change the tone, it heightens the tragedy, because resistance here does not signal hope, it signals misunderstanding. The belief that effort alone can alter fate. The revelation that follows is devastating precisely because it does not explode outward. It collapses inward. Identity horror replaces physical threat. The self becomes unsafe, and the damage is irreversible. This is where the film completes its transformation. The monster is no longer external, it is genealogical, psychological, and permanent, ensuring that escape is no longer possible even in theory. The maiming that follows is not symbolic triumph, it is literal loss. Luke is diminished rather than enhanced, aligning him with horror survivors who carry visible scars rather than trophies. The final movements of the film deny restoration. There is no return to a known world, only repair and waiting. The characters look outward into uncertainty rather than inward toward relief. The last images emphasize suspension, not resolution. The threat has not been neutralized, it has simply receded, which is perhaps the most unsettling ending horror can offer. By refusing catharsis, the film commits fully to dread. It teaches the audience that the story has not paused for recovery, it has merely inhaled before continuing. The Empire Strikes Back thus operates as a horror film wearing the skin of a space opera, using inevitability, isolation, and psychological rupture to reshape the saga from within. Its genius lies not in shocking moments, but in sustained pressure, the feeling that something is always approaching, always closing the distance, regardless of effort or intent. Every creative choice reinforces this thesis, from framing to pacing to character motivation, ensuring that fear is not a momentary reaction, but a constant state. By the time the screen fades, the audience is not relieved. They are braced, which is the ultimate success of horror storytelling. The denial of catharsis at the end of The Empire Strikes Back is not a pause between adventures, it is the final proof of its horror grammar. Because horror does not end when the monster disappears. It ends when the audience realizes the monster never needed to be destroyed to win, only understood too late. Vader's survival is not framed as escape or retreat. He does not flee, he does not hurry. He simply exits the narrative space with the same calm authority he entered it, reinforcing that nothing in the story has altered his position or power. This absence of consequence is deeply unsettling because cinema trains audiences to expect balance. Even villains are meant to pay some cost, but horror denies this transaction. The monster persists unchanged while others absorb the damage. In this sense, Vader's departure is more frightening than his presence, because it confirms that the events of the film were not a climactic disruption. They were routine, another step in an ongoing process that cannot be interrupted by bravery alone. The revelation of lineage is structured not as spectacle, but as violation. The camera does not celebrate the moment, it corners Luke, pins him against the truth, and forces him to confront an identity that redefines every prior choice. Horror often attacks certainty before flesh, and here the narrative dismantles the hero's sense of self, retroactively poisoning memory, mentorship, and destiny, making even the past unsafe to inhabit. This is why the twist lands with such permanence. It cannot be undone by future victories. Knowledge cannot be unlearned, and the monster now exists inside the protagonist's bloodline rather than across the battlefield. Luke's scream is not defiance, it is collapse, a refusal to integrate the truth, because integration would mean acknowledging that the war is no longer external, it is personal, inherited, and inescapable. The physical maiming that follows is almost redundant. The psychological damage has already occurred. The loss of the hand merely externalizes what has already been taken: wholeness, innocence, certainty. In horror tradition, survivors do not emerge stronger. They emerge altered, marked by what they endured. And Luke's mechanical replacement is not a symbol of empowerment. It is a reminder that something organic is gone forever. The medical bay scene reinforces this tone. The technology is cold, impersonal, and quiet. There is no celebratory relief, only maintenance, as if survival itself requires constant artificial support. Leia's presence offers no romantic closure. Their bond is unresolved, complicated by loss and future threat. Love exists but cannot shield. Another horror principle, where connection does not equal safety. Han's absence hangs over the final moments like a phantom limb, unresolved trauma embodied in carbonite. A fate worse than death because it suspends suffering, rather than ending it. Horror thrives on unfinished. Business and Han's capture ensures that the story cannot settle. One of its core emotional anchors is literally frozen in terror, awaiting an unknown future. The visual language of the closing scenes emphasizes distance and waiting. Characters gaze outward, not toward each other, framed against vast emptiness, reinforcing isolation even in companionship. Space itself becomes a symbol of dread, not wonder, an infinite void where threats travel unchecked, and rescue is delayed by scale rather than courage. There is no sense that time heals here, only that it stretches, prolonging anxiety. The heroes are not regrouping to strike back. They are bracing for what comes next. The music does not swell into triumph. It lingers, restrained, almost mournful, denying the audience emotional release and reinforcing that this chapter ends in tension rather than resolution. This refusal to reassure is the film's boldest choice, because it trusts discomfort to carry the narrative forward rather than spectacle or victory. Viewed through this lens, The Empire Strikes Back is less a middle chapter and more a sustained nightmare, one that rewires expectations about what a Star Wars film can be. Its structure aligns with horror cycles, where escalation replaces closure. Each encounter deepens the wound rather than sealing it, ensuring that continuation feels necessary, not optional. The Empire's dominance is not challenged philosophically or militarily. It is endured, and endurance becomes the defining trait of the protagonists rather than triumph. Even Yoda's teachings, often remembered as hopeful, are framed as warnings. His language emphasizes failure, loss, and the difficulty of return. Wisdom here is grim, not inspiring. The Force itself feels less like a gift and more like a burden, demanding sacrifice without guaranteeing protection. Another inversion that aligns the mythology with horror rather than fantasy. What makes this approach so effective is its subtlety. The film never announces itself as horror. It simply applies horror logic consistently, allowing the audience to feel the unease without being told why. This is why its legacy endures, not because it is darker in tone alone, but because it is disciplined in its denial of comfort, resisting the urge to reassure even when reassurance would be easy. The Empire Strikes Back teaches that fear does not require jump scares or grotesque imagery. It requires patience, inevitability, and the courage to leave wounds open. By the end, the audience understands that the story has crossed a threshold, innocence is gone, and the future will demand reckoning rather than adventure. This realization retroactively reshapes the saga, turning the original film into a prologue of false safety and the finale into not a victory lap, but an attempt at healing what can never fully heal. In horror, survival is not the end, it is the beginning of aftermath, and this film ends squarely in that space where damage has been done and must now be lived with. That is why the final image resonates, not because it promises hope, but because it acknowledges uncertainty, the most honest ending horror can offer. The monster is still alive, the truth still burns, and the characters are changed forever, which is precisely why the film remains so powerful decades later. It does not frighten by showing death, it frightens by showing what survives and what survival costs. With that, this analysis reaches its conclusion, fully closing the arc of how The Empire Strikes Back operates as horror rather than adventure, from its opening dread to its unresolved final breath.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.